If you are just joining us, you're joining us in the middle of a series in the book of Genesis following the life of Abraham. And we've been following along through Abraham's life, and it's been very interesting, to say the least. Now, if you know the word, finish this line for me. Neighbours should be there for one another. That's when good neighbours become good friends. Yes, you might not be aware of what that is, but Neighbours, it's Australia's longest running TV show, Neighbours, and it finished recently. It ran for a staggering 37 years. Wow, some of us aren't even 37 years old. How could they keep people watching week after week for over 8,000 episodes? Well, how was Neighbours such a popular show that went for so long? Well, the show was a drama, and specifically a family drama. Neighbours was about family problems, intergenerational clashes, school problems, romances, domestic issues, infertility, incest, you name it. But if you think the show Neighbours had drama, well, what have we seen from Abraham and Sarah? If you've been following along, it's been a bit like an episode of Neighbours each week. And in an episode of Neighbours, they kind of recap. So let me recap for you on what's happened so far. Abraham, he was 75 years old, and he was sent out from his home in Ur to the promised land that God had promised him. God was going to bless him and bless the whole world through him, and he would have children, descendants. And this was a big deal in their culture to have descendants, and particularly a big deal for him and his wife Sarah, who were barren. They get to the land, they have to leave. He practically gives up his wife to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. His nephew Lot and him, they fight over pasture. Lot gets kidnapped. And in last week's episode, we saw that they couldn't wait. And Sarah says to Abraham, "Take my servant and have a child with her." And Ishmael is born. And then there's more drama, more fighting. And it's about 14 years later when we get to our episode today, and still there is no child except for Ishmael, this child born with their slave woman. And so in today's passage, Abraham is about 99 years old. And it's been 24 years of drama and waiting. I mean, if you thought Neighbours was a long-running drama, it's got nothing on Abraham and Sarah. And today's episode is full of drama as well. We get a visit from mysterious strangers. Sarah laughs at God's promise. Abraham haggles with God. Abraham's nephew Lot is living in the middle of the depraved city of Sodom. We know Abraham didn't have great neighbours, and the city of Sodom was certainly that. Lot's son-in-laws laugh at the idea that God would judge them. Destruction, incest. Today's episode is full of drama. And unlike Neighbours, these are real people living in a real world, and it's tragic to see. And we too are real people living in a real world under the same curses of sin. Our families, our city, our very souls bear the same tragic drama as sin just wreaks havoc across our lives. And so like Abraham and Sarah, we're left asking, well, God, what are you going to do about all this? Does God really care about sin, how it's wrecking Abraham's lives, our lives, and the world? But we see in this passage that God really cares about sin. His justice is real, and God has a plan to save. But it seems kind of crazy and laughable. A 99-year-old man and his 90-year-old wife are going to have a baby, become a huge nation, and somehow their family will undo the curse of sin and bless the world. It's a bit like when you watch one of those movies or dramas and you think to yourself, the plot's gone here and there, and you're thinking, how are they going to pull this all together at the end? They've only got 30 minutes left. It's like that. And yet God does this. He pulls it all together beautifully in Jesus, as we'll see. And so in today's passage, we'll have 3 points: hurried hospitality, and the laughable news, God's judgment and Abraham's intercession, and thirdly, judgment of Sin City and God's mercy in chapter 19. But we'll start with our first point, hurried hospitality and the laughable news. Hurry, hurry, hurry. And this week, we find Abraham, and he's sitting by the entrance to his tent. It's the middle of the day. It's probably hot. He's probably just had his main meal for the day. And I imagine if I was Abraham, I'd probably thinking about having a nap at that point, a bit like some of you may be feeling later today after having a big lunch. You can imagine his droopy eyelids, but through the shimmering heat, he can see three figures. Now, I'm not sure about you, but I'd be pretty tempted just to shut my eyes and just go to sleep and pretend you hadn't seen them, but not Abraham. No, Abraham shows extraordinary hospitality, but he also has some extraordinary guests. And we're told one of them is God. How exactly God is appearing like this and how exactly Abraham recognizes him, we're not told. But the elderly Abraham leaps to his feet and he runs to wait on them hand and foot. Now, it's worth saying that in that society, hospitality is very highly valued. In those days, there were no hotels or motels. But Abraham's generosity here is extraordinary. And we see how the narrator keeps expressing again Abraham's hurry. Hurry is a repeated word in it. Hurry, hurry, hurry. He goes quickly to the tent. He says, Sarah, quick, make some bread. And then quick, he's off to the paddock to get a calf for dinner. Quick, the young man quickly prepares it, and he brings it to the visitors. You can almost imagine the kind of out-of-breath elderly Abraham as he gets back to them with the food and he's panting. But Abraham is being generous here, and we see that too in what he brings. We see he humbly asks the visitors to stay, so he says that he might give them a morsel of bread. But he asks Sarah to get 3 seahs of flour. It's worth saying that's about 20 kilograms of flour. More than that, it's fine flour, the good stuff. And then the calf. He doesn't just pick some old cow, he goes for the tender, young heifer, prime steak. And then he brings meat as well. This is an ancient Near Eastern feast. But Abraham, he doesn't just dig in himself as well. We're told in verse 8 that like a servant, he stands by as they eat. Abraham is both humble and generous here, but the question is, why? Well, Abraham is generous because he's been changed by a generous God. We've seen that week after week, haven't we? God's been at work in Abraham. He's seen God's generosity to him, and now he's been transformed to be extravagantly generous himself. But when you know a generous God, you're changed by him. But the question remains, well, what about us? We too know the same generous God as Abraham, don't we? We know how generous God has been to us. Just stop and think for a moment about everything that God has generously given you. I mean, I think we are a generous church. People really show hospitality. The other night at the men's fire night, David Flaherty, he hurried out and set up the fire pit and chairs. Then it looked like he was going to rain, so he hurried and moved them all under the shed so we could get there. The sun came out and he hurried to bring it all back out so that we'd have a wonderful evening together. Now that's generosity shaped by a generous God. So let me encourage you. How can you show hospitality, even this week, even after the service today? Don't feel like you have to get a whole cow like Abraham. This isn't the ancient Near East. Sometimes simple is best. Or even if having people in your home isn't practical, you can always go out for a coffee or something like that. Let's be transformed by the generosity of our generous God and show that through hospitality. But of course, the question remains, well, why has God come for the visit to Abraham? It wasn't just for the good food. We see in verse 9 the reason that he's here. They ask, where is Sarah? Sarah and the laughable promise. The Lord says to Abraham and Sarah, who's listening the whole time inside the tent, I'll come back next year and Sarah will have a son. Now Sarah hears this and she laughs. This promise is laughable. And God asks Abraham, why did Sarah laugh? She denies it. I didn't laugh. But God says, no, you did laugh. But can we really blame her? I mean, what God's talking about here, it's impossible. And we'll see there's 3 problems with this. The first problem is that they're old. The second problem is they don't have a great marriage. And the third problem is that marriage in general has been wrecked by Adam and Eve and their sin in the garden. And so God's going to need to overcome these 3 problems for them to have a child. Now let's slow down and look at these 3 problems a bit more deeply. First, they're old. And I mean really old. In her own words, Sarah in verse 12 says that she's worn out. And she asks, how will I have delight or pleasure? And the word here for delight or pleasure, it's based on the name of Eden in the Hebrew, which means delight or bliss. It reminds us of the Garden of Eden. Now, certainly more broadly, having a child will be a great pleasure and a joy. But Sarah here, this word's quite particular, and she's thinking about the way of having children. Now, we don't know about the ins and outs of Sarah and Abraham's marriage, but it seems that they aren't even sleeping together, let alone this being even something they enjoy. Now, this is all a part of the aging process, which the narrator points out twice. They're old and advanced in years, and even Sarah points out they're old. But the Bible is quite direct here in what it's talking about in Abraham and Sarah's intimacy here. And this whole passage is quite a bit more direct and explicit than what we're probably used to. And I'm aware that we're not all 18 here, over 18 sitting here today. Now, as a bit of a pastoral side note, as you know, I was previously a doctor, and I understand the practicalities of intimacy for married people as they age, like Sarah and Abraham. I've worked with the gynecologists and the urologists, and when particularly things change for just the man or just the woman, this can be quite difficult in relationships. There's many an article or a news reel about the difficulties that this can have in relationship and affect the whole relationship. We might ask things like, will he still love me? Will she still think I'm a man? But for married Christian people, we have the power of the gospel of unconditional love at the center of our marriages. And so we keep caring for one another in sickness and in health, just like we promised. So let me encourage you, talk honestly for the sake of love, even when it's embarrassing. And for the younger married people here who may think to themselves, I don't know what we're talking about, or this doesn't apply to me, I want you to just store this away in the back of your head, because you'll need this one day. But it's not just the physical effects of aging that Sarah and Abraham have going on here. We also see they don't have a great marriage. And we can see that, don't we? Abraham hands Sarah over to the Egyptians. Sarah hands her servant Hagar over to Abraham. God's going to have to overcome a lot of problems in their marriage as well for them to be able to have a child. And thirdly, let's just step back a little bit more broadly and see what we learn about marriage in Genesis as a whole. Now, it's pretty clear that Abraham and Sarah don't have a perfect marriage, and it's not a stretch to say it might not even be a good marriage. Abraham has more of his fair share than blame here. After all, Abraham, like the serpent in the garden, he lies with a half-truth, doesn't he? Oh, Sarah, she's not my wife, she's my half-sister, even though she is. But also Sarah, last week, she had the idea to take her slave girl and give her to Abraham to have a son. just like Eve taking from the fruit in the garden, shortcutting blessing, not trusting God to bless. But also Abraham, he's a bit like Adam. Abraham, he just passively stands there and doesn't do anything. He just goes along with it. And all this sin breaks down the naked trust of Adam and Eve, and this spills out for all of humanity, and we see the effects of sin in Abraham and Sarah's marriage, and we see the effects in our world today. I mean, God's really got his work cut out for him here, doesn't he? He doesn't only have to overcome the fact that Abraham and Sarah are old and dying, he's got to overcome the effect of sin in marriage and relationships. I mean, will they know the pleasure, the Eden of a perfect marriage? Remember, I said before, the word reminds us of the Garden of Eden, that bliss that Adam and Eve had before sin. Well, if you want to see, come back next week and see what God does. But the answer's in our passage as well. Look at verse 14. Verse 14. Is anything too hard for the Lord? It's a rhetorical question, isn't it? The answer is no. Old age, marital problems, sin, they cannot stop God. They will have a child 1 year later. But what about the damage does to relationships in general? What about our relationships? Well, let me warn you, the rest of the Bible story, we never see perfect relationships, let alone a perfect marriage. And we know this too, don't we? Married, unmarried, divorced, widowed, you name it. But the laughable plan of God is to bless the world by miraculously making a child from a barren couple. And doesn't that remind us of the fulfillment? The plan when a virgin called Mary, a descendant of Abraham and Sarah, will have a son, and he will finally bring blessing to the world, the miraculous child. And in Jesus, we know the perfect restoration of relationship. And in the New Testament, we do actually see the perfect marriage in Ephesians 5. Ephesians 5 tells us that marriage is a picture of Jesus and the church. Now, a friend of mine, Susan Arn, she wrote an article about her struggles of being a single Christian woman. But she also reminds us of the incredible love that all Christians know in Jesus, and that Ephesians 5 is actually for all Christians, not just married Christians. She says in her article, a quick survey of the romance movies and books would seem to confirm it. What makes a woman swoon is the idea that someone might love them so sacrificially, like we see in Ephesians 5. Therefore, when they do not have a husband to love them like this yearning can lead to pain, bitterness, envy, and disappointment. Except, she says, we are loved in this way. Believers already have access to this tremendous love that everyone dreams and desires of. See, in Jesus, we are his bride, the church. And when he returns, he will swoop in to save us. Adam and Abraham were passive. They just let sin take its course, but not Jesus. He has saved us, his bride, the church. And you know, when the Bible says when Jesus returns, it will be like a wedding banquet, and all the mess of sin will be fixed. But how can we know that this happens? This seems like such a big promise. But we're reminded in this passage, aren't we? Nothing is too hard for God. And so our second point, God's judgment and Abraham's intercession. In the next section, God and the two offsiders, they get up and they go to leave. But here God kind of lets Abraham in on what's going to happen next. And we see God really care about sin and righteousness. And he wants Abraham to live a righteous life. We see that in verse 19. And for his family beyond him. Now, it's interesting that we're now talking about righteousness because up to this point, God hasn't really asked much of Abraham, has he? I mean, God's just been making wonderful promises again after again to bless Abraham, and all he asks Abraham to do is trust him. And last week we see keep the covenant of circumcision. Now, this all seems very strange to us, doesn't it? Because in the order of most of our relationships, it goes like this, doesn't it? You do good for someone, and then they like you, right? That's how it works. So naturally, we think it's the same with God. Okay, I need to change my life, clean up my act, and only then God will love me and save me. It's a bit like you've got to eat your greens before you can have your dessert, right? You've got to be a good boy or girl, and only then will God love you. But that's not the story of the Bible. That's not what we see again and again. No, in the Bible, it goes the other way. God just picks Abraham, seemingly at random, and says, I'm going to bless you, Abraham. Even though you keep messing it up, I will keep my promise. Now you're one of my people, you'll need to live my way, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, as we read in the passage, and for your children beyond you. But that's how God works. With God, it goes the other way. He blesses us, He loves us, and then we change the way we live. And we see that's really good news for us for two reasons. Firstly, we've seen how Abraham and Sarah just keep making a mess of things, don't they? We just keep seeing the drama week after week. They could be never good enough for God to love them. And if we're perfectly honest, it's the same for us, isn't it? If we're honest, we admit we're probably a bit more like Abraham and Sarah than we'd like to say. But hasn't it been amazing that the Bible's so honest about Abraham and Sarah and their shortcomings? Because the truth is, we're the same. But because God loves us first, and then we change. The second thing we see is that God is saving Abraham and his descendants, not just from sin, but to a better life. It's worth remembering that as God's people, we're not just saved from judgment, we're saved to. Not just saved from, but saved to a life God's way, keeping the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice. And that living God's way is actually a good thing. I mean, life under sin was terrible. Just wait till we get to Sodom next, you'll see. But living life God's way is its own reward. You see, when you do good things for God, you haven't done God a favor. No, God's done you a favor. When you hold your tongue, when you're patient with that frustrating person, when you bless someone instead of curse them, that is the full and righteous life of living as a Christian now. It sounds subtle, but the order is important. The world thinks, I do good, and then God rewards me. But actually, we know from the Bible, God loves me, and then He rewards me, giving me good things to do. That is the difference in order and the difference of being a Christian. The other thing we see in the passage is God's justice from verses 20 to 21. Because remember, God said, Abraham, I'm going to let you in on what's going to happen next. And God says in verse 20, because of the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin is grave, verse 21, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me. And if not, I will know. And now we see Abraham's intercession. Yes, God is merciful, but He's also just. And the city of Sodom and Gomorrah are bad, and God's going to go and see. But we know, don't we, from previous weeks, and Abraham knows, and of course God knows as well, that Sodom and Gomorrah are bad places, and God will destroy them. But we also know, and Abraham knows, that his nephew Lot lives in Sodom. Abraham had to save Lot because of trouble in Sodom before, and now Abraham is stepping in to try and do so again. And in this passage, we get this very strange conversation between Abraham and God from verses 22 to 33, where Abraham, he's very reverent and humble, but he asks God to save the city for the sake of the righteous who are there. Why can Abraham be so bold with God? Only because he knows God's justice. In verse 25, we see Abraham say, far be it for you to do such a thing. to put the righteous to death with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it for you. Shall not the judge of the whole earth do what is just? Basically, Abraham says here, God, I know that you are righteous and just, and you won't condemn someone who is righteous. And so then we get Abraham interceding. We get this 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. But what if there's only one? Then we get this numbers game. Abraham starts with 50, doesn't he? He says, God, well, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you condemn the city? And God's answer, being just, is, of course, no. And then he tries 45, no. 40, no. 30, no. Well, what about 20? No. Keeps going. What about if there are 10? No. And at this point, we're kind of like, come on, Abraham. Ask him, Abraham. Ask him. What about one? What if there is only one righteous person? But Abraham balks. He stops at 10, thinking, surely there must be 10 righteous people. Is God, and this asks a big question of theology in the Bible, is God somehow able to overlook the sin of the many for the sake of the righteousness of one? The righteousness of one. As we will see, there aren't even 10 righteous people in Sodom, and that's the reality of sin. But this opens up an interesting question in the story of the Bible. Can God in his justice be just, but still somehow not condemn the many for the sake of the one? Well, this question that's kind of opened up and left hanging for us in Genesis is answered in Jesus. You see, Jesus was perfectly righteous. He was the only one who deserved God's love. We deserve God's judgment. But at the cross, Jesus swaps us. He swaps us our sin for his perfect righteousness. It's not just that Jesus takes all our sin, he gives us all his righteousness. And now God doesn't see us as somehow neutral. No. We have Jesus' perfect righteousness. It's credited to us, just as Abraham's righteousness was credited to him. The righteousness of one can now be the righteousness of the many. And Jesus' righteousness is now ours. And here in Abraham's life, we see the foundations of the gospel building. And we now know that we are righteous before God, even though we continue to sin and stuff up. But God saves us and he sees us as Christ, just as with Jesus' righteousness. And we can boldly approach him in prayer knowing that. Our third point, the judgment of Sin City and God's mercy from chapter 19. Our final point, the judgment of Sodom. Now, I wonder how you feel before a test or a big exam, maybe at school or uni or trade school. Most people feel pretty nervous or apprehensive before a big test, right? I know I do, but that's only natural. But there's sometimes you can be a bit more nervous or filled with a bit more dread, and that happens when you know that you haven't studied. And you start to think to yourself, oh, this is not going to go well. And in chapter 19, we had the same apprehension when it comes to Sodom. This is not going to go well. The two angels go down to see what Sodom is like, and we can see, like the kid who hasn't studied, Sodom doesn't know what's coming for it. And so as we unpack chapter 19, we'll see it actually mirrors chapter 18. We'll see Abraham shows hospitality to strangers. Lot shows hospitality to strangers. Sarah laughed at the news of a baby, and Lot's nephews laugh at the idea of God's justice. And finally, we'll see God's justice and mercy. So let's start with hospitality in verse 1. The two angels, they come to Sodom in the evening, and Lot's sitting at the gate. And when Lot sees them, he rises and he goes to meet them. He bows himself with his face to the earth and he asks them, "Oh, come and stay at my place." They say, "No worries, we'll sleep out here in the city square." Lot becomes very insistent. And in verse 3, he's pressing them strongly. You see, Lot knows you don't want to be outside at night in Sodom. Lot's learnt a lot from Abraham, and he learns to be generous. He makes them a feast and they stay. But you've got to ask a few questions of Lot here. Why is Lot living in the city? I mean, Lot is a nomadic herdsman like Abraham. Why is he now living in the city that caused him so much trouble? He got kidnapped earlier because of it. And why then does he own a house in the city? I mean, Abraham lives in a tent. He wants nothing to do with the city. But here, Lot is living in a house. And then we see Lot sitting at the city gate when they arrive. In those days, the city gate was more than just a door. It was kind of like the council chambers. It was where the elders and nobles would come to discuss legal and civic matters. Yeah, a bit like the council chambers that we have down in the city here. Remember, Abraham and Lot left the big city in Babylon to move to the promised land. And like all migrants, they hoped that they'd get rich and make a name for themselves. And we find that Lot's living the dream here. He's a someone in the city. They even call him a judge later, don't they? But he's a someone in Sin City, in Sodom, and that's not a good thing. Then in verses 4 to 11, we see the sin of the city. The angels are about to go to bed, and there's a commotion outside. All the men in the city are there, we're told, young and old, and they want to know these strangers. And again, we're not all over 18 here, but I think you know what's going on here. Lot goes outside and he tries to reason with the mob. In verse 7, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly." Again, we see how comfortable Lot had become. He calls them brothers. Lot thought he could live in the city of Sodom and not be affected by the sin of the people. But we just see how bad things have gotten here. And of course, offering up his daughters, it's an inexcusable thing for Lot to do. But this just shows how desperate he is and how depraved Sodom was and how much it was affecting Lot. And up until verse 10, but then the angels rescue Lot and they blind the mob. But the mob doesn't even give up at that point and go home. They wore themselves out, we're told, groping around looking for the door. Verses 12 to 14, the laughable news. The angels ask Lot, does he have any family in the city? Get them out, because the city's about to be destroyed. Lot goes to his son-in-laws, but they just laugh at him. What laughable news they must have thought. How tragic, though, because they were so close to being saved. Lot was holding out life to them. How many people in our own city of Toowoomba are just the same? They don't think Jesus is coming back. It's laughable to them. What do you think most people are doing on a Sunday morning? But we are holding out life to them in Jesus, but they don't want to hear it, and they think it's a joke. And so we need to keep praying for them, don't we? This year is our year of prayer. And we're encouraging one another to pray regularly for our neighbour on our left and on our right. When you go to put the bin out or go to check the mail, whatever the habit is, we want to keep praying for those on our left and our right by name, that God would save them and that he would use us in that. Church, let's keep doing that. Verse 15 to 29, Lot lingers, but God is merciful. Why? Why is God merciful? Well, we see here from verse 15, it's dawn, and the angels are urging Lot to get out, but Lot lingers. He's too entranced by the city life. The angels kind of have to grab him, manhandle him and his family by the hand and pull them out of the city. The key word here is merciful. Verse 16, the Lord is being merciful to him. And the angels tell him, flee to the hills. Don't even look back, they say. But Lot drags his feet again. Oh, can I flee to Zorah? That little city over there. It's just a little one, Lot says. Like somehow the sin is not so bad because the city is small. You see, Lot is in love with the city life, and God shows his mercy again and lets him flee to the nearby city. You see, Lot loves the city life, doesn't he? He'd put down roots. We know from Hebrews that Abraham, he was waiting for a holy city. Like we sung in that song, By Faith, for a holy city built by God's own hands where peace and justice reign. But Lot and his family loved Sodom, and it cost Lot everything. We're told even his wife looked back at the city and was destroyed herself. Church, are we a little bit too comfortable here in comfortable Toowoomba? It's a beautiful city, isn't it? Filled with so many comforts. But we've got to remember, we're just passing through here. We've got to remember, as Christians, we never really own our home, we're only renting. We don't have a forever home here. No, the New Jerusalem, God's new creation, that's our true home. That's our forever home. And I guarantee when Jesus returns and you're fleeing to the New Jerusalem, you won't turn back and look at Toowoomba. It will be so wonderful and glorious. Your eyes will be filled and fixed with it because there God lives with us. Let's be like Abraham and keep trusting God's promise of a better world. And then there's verses 30 to 39, Lot's daughters and intergenerational sin. In our final section, we see just how bad things have gotten. And I think we're meant to be shocked by this. Lot flees to the little city of Zorah, but he fears to live there, the city life again, and eventually he ends up in the hills, just like the angels told him originally. And now Lot's living in a cave. He was once a super wealthy pastoralist with gold who chose to live in the fertile valley. He was even a someone in the city of Sodom. But now here he is, washed up, living in a cave. Now he even loses his family. And we see the trauma of sin is intergenerational. Lot's own daughters become as perverse as Sodom. They get Lot drunk to become pregnant by him. And they become the perverse neighbors of the nation of Israel. We're told in the passage, intergenerational sin, it goes on, and they become the Moabites, Israel's neighbors. The Moabites means from the father, and they become the Ammonites, meaning son of my kin. This teaches the Israelites who would have read this passage that when you sin, you leave an inheritance of sin for those that come after you. And we learn this too, don't we? If you needed just another reason not to sin, remember that our sin today leaves a lasting impact for those who come after us. And yet, we also heard God say to Abraham in the passage that he would love righteousness and justice, and that his family and the nation would come after him would love that too. In the same way that we can leave an inheritance in our sin, we can leave an inheritance in our trust in God. After all, haven't we all inherited the good of those who've come before us? Those Christians in your own spiritual family history who've blessed you. Whose spiritual family history are you a part of? Who are you blessing in the generations to come? So in conclusion, we've seen a really bleak and dark picture of sin at work in the world here. My own reflection as I've been digging into this passage this week is I just felt the weight and the burden of sin in this, and it's really bleak. And I think it's okay for us to come away from this feeling the heaviness of that. But we also see God's righteous judgment for sin, but we also see God's mercy. that God has showed us great mercy in Jesus. God is holding off the final judgment of the whole world as he shows mercy and saves. And we are the recipients of that, and we can be a part of that work. Let me pray for us.